The late September sun blazed like a furnace over Silver Knife stockyards, casting razor-sharp shadows between weathered wooden rails where cattle shifted restlessly in the oppressive heat. Through the shimmering air came a sound that turned every rancher's blood to ice, the thunderous bellow of a longhorn bull consumed by murderous fury. The massive gray beast, battle-scarred from years in the savage wilderness beyond the Gila River, erupted through the holding pen's barriers like a locomotive derailing at full speed. His 6-foot horn span gleamed like polished ivory as he charged toward a cluster of children who had been watching the cattle sorting from what their mothers believed was complete safety. "Mary, Mother of God, get those children back!" Bill Crawford, the stockyard foreman, screamed as terror seized his throat. He watched 2,000 pounds of pure rage bearing down on 6-year-old Tommy Whitman, who stood frozen like a rabbit, mesmerized by a striking rattlesnake. In that crystalline moment when death approached on thundering hooves, Giselle Morrison moved with instincts deeper than conscious thought. The 22-year-old ranch owner threw herself between the charging beast and the paralyzed child, her worn calico dress billowing, as she snatched Tommy into her arms and dove toward the questionable shelter of an overturned watering trough. The bull's left horn scraped past her shoulder, tearing fabric and drawing a thin line of crimson, but she pressed forward until the boy was safely pressed against the wooden barrier. "Stay down, Tommy, and don't move so much as a whisker," she commanded, her voice steady despite the metallic taste of fear flooding her mouth. She held the trembling child against her side, while the bull wheeled around seeking fresh targets with rolling white eyes that spoke of ancient wildness, barely contained by civilization's fragile constraints. That's when her gaze found him across the chaotic stockyard. The stranger stood motionless at the crowd's edge like a shadow given human form. While everyone else shouted and scrambled for safety, he observed the rampaging animal with the focused intensity of a hawk studying wounded prey. He was tall and lean, with a bronze skin and raven-black hair that marked his Apache heritage, dressed in well-worn buckskin pants and shirt that had seen hard service in harsh territory. A coiled rawhide rope hung across his broad shoulders, and his moccasins made no sound on the churned earth as he moved closer to the unfolding catastrophe. Their eyes met across the stockyard, his obsidian dark and measuring every detail with predator's precision. Hers emerald green and blazing with protective fury. And something passed between them in that instant, a recognition that neither could explain, but both felt resonating in their bones like distant thunder. The bull snorted jets of steam through flared nostrils, pawing the hardpan with hooves that could crush a man's skull like an eggshell. His attention fixed on a group of Mexican vaqueros attempting to reach their horses at the far corral. The massive beast lowered his scarred head and charged again, this time with enough force to shatter a section of fence rail and create a dangerous gap that threatened to release the entire herd into Silver Knife's main street. Without conscious thought, Giselle released Tommy to his mother's desperate embrace and moved toward the broken barrier. The splintered timber was heavy as lead and full of razor-sharp edges that bit into her palms like angry hornets. But she gripped the rail and tried to lift it back into position while the vaqueros scrambled to safety. Suddenly, powerful hands appeared beside hers on the rough wood. The Apache had vaulted the outer fence with the fluid grace of a stalking wolf, and now helped support the broken barrier. Their fingers overlapped on the weathered timber, and she felt the calloused strength in his grip, the steady warmth of hands that had known both violence and gentle work in equal measure. "Can you hold it steady?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying the faint accent of someone who had learned English as a second tongue, but spoke it with careful precision. "I can manage," she replied, though they both understood she needed his strength to make any real difference. Together, they held the rail in place until the last vaquero reached safety, then released it with a crash that sent alkali grit spiraling into the superheated air. The stranger turned to study the bull with those penetrating black eyes. And Giselle found herself studying him with equal intensity, noting the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of years squinting into desert sun, and the small scars that marked someone who had lived dangerously and survived through wit and skill rather than mere luck. There was something about his stillness that reminded her of the desert wildcats that sometimes prowled the high country around her ranch, dangerous beyond question, but not to those who offered no threat to their purposes. "You're not thinking of trying for that bull," she said, and it wasn't quite a question, but carried the weight of concern for a stranger who had already risked himself to help others. From across the stockyard, Mike Henderson's voice boomed like cannon fire over a battlefield. $50 to any man with sand enough to ride that devil for 1 full minute, cash money paid on the barrelhead. At 40 years old, Henderson possessed the build of a prize bull himself, thick through the chest and shoulders with pale eyes that missed nothing and hands soft from counting other men's money rather than earning his own through honest labor. He owned more land than any 3 men should rightfully control, including the very stockyard where they now stood, and his smile held all the warmth of winter wind through tombstones. "Oui, sir." $50 represents considerable supplies in country this hard, the Apache observed, still watching the bull with that unwavering focus that reminded Giselle of a circling buzzard. "It also represents a pine coffin and 6 feet of desert hardpan if you make one mistake with that monster," she warned. "That beast has already killed 1 man this month, and he's looking eager for another chance to add to his tally." His mouth quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile, but his eyes remained serious as storm clouds gathering over the mountains. The desert teaches patience to those who would survive. This one has forgotten he was once free. Before she could voice further objections, he was walking toward the center of the stockyard with measured steps, unwinding the rope from his shoulders with practiced ease. The bull noticed his approach immediately and stood motionless, massive head lowered, weighing this new challenger with the calculating intelligence of a creature that had survived by eliminating anything foolish enough to test its dominance. "Waski?" "What's your name, stranger?" called Bill Crawford, wiping nervous perspiration from his weathered brow. "Nayati," came the simple reply. "Ooh. Well, Nayati, I surely hope you've made your peace with the Almighty, because that bull has sent more than 1 good man to his final reward." Instead of responding, Nayati continued his steady approach, and the crowd gradually fell silent as they sensed something different about this man who walked toward death without apparent fear or foolish bravado. There was a quality about him that spoke of battles fought and won in places where weakness meant unmarked graves and quick forgetting. The bull lowered its head and charged with the devastating force of an avalanche, breaking loose from a mountainside, hooves pounding the earth like war drums echoing across some ancient battlefield. But instead of dodging or fleeing like any sensible man would do, Nayati stood his ground until the last possible heartbeat, then stepped smoothly to his left toward the animal's partially blind side, where an old scar clouded the left eye like tarnished silver. His hand shot out and grasped the base of the right horn, using the bull's own tremendous momentum to vault himself onto its back in one fluid motion that spoke of years spent among horses and cattle in country, where a single miscalculation meant death without appeal or second chances. What followed would be discussed in Silver Knife saloons and around ranch house fires for years to come. The bull exploded into a frenzy of bucking and spinning, employing every trick it had learned in its battles with desert predators, rival bulls, and the unforgiving wilderness that had shaped its violent nature. But Nayati moved with the animal as if they shared the same heartbeat, his powerful legs gripping its sides, while his left hand wove the rope into a crude bridle around the beast's foam-flecked muzzle. The 30 seconds. Someone in the crowd shouted over the thunder of hooves and the creaking of strained leather. The bull attempted to rush toward the fence, intending to scrape its unwelcome passenger against the rails like a man might scrape mud from his boots. But Nayati anticipated the strategy and pulled the massive head away from its blind spot, forcing the animal to turn before impact. He was reading its movements like familiar scripture, turning its own strength and cunning against it, with the patient skill of a master strategist. 45 seconds. The crowd rose to its feet, cheering and gasping as man and beast battled in a swirling cloud of alkali powder that caught the afternoon light like golden smoke. Giselle realized she was holding her breath, her hands clenched so tightly that her nails were cutting half-moon crescents into her palms. There was something mesmerizing about watching this deadly dance, something that spoke to parts of her soul she hadn't known existed until this moment of raw courage and skill. The church bell's bronze voice chimed the hour just as Nayati released his grip and rolled clear of the bull, landing hard but intact in the churned earth. The massive animal stood confused for a moment, its rage suddenly spent like a thunderstorm that had blown itself out against the mountains, then trotted calmly to the far end of the pen, as if nothing unusual had occurred. Silence held the stockyard like a held breath, then erupted into wild applause and cheering that could be heard 3 blocks away in every direction. Mike Henderson climbed down from his elevated platform, his florid face showing something that wasn't quite anger, but certainly wasn't pleasure either. He counted out $50 silver into Nayati's palm without comment, but his pale eyes promised that this public humiliation would be neither forgotten nor forgiven. "For quite a performance, Apache," Henderson said finally, his voice carrying the kind of false warmth that chilled rather than comforted. "Hope you're not planning to make Silverknife your permanent home. Town's already got more than enough drifters and troublemakers cluttering up the landscape." Nayati pocketed the money without response, but Giselle caught the way his hand rested casually near the bone-handled knife at his belt. This man might speak softly, but he was far from defenseless, and something in his posture suggested he had faced men like Henderson before and survived the encounters. As the crowd began to disperse, she approached with a strip of cloth torn from her petticoat. "That cut needs proper tending," she said, nodding toward the blood seeping through his shirt sleeve where the bull's horn had found its mark during the initial charge. "Wounds heal if you let them," Nayati replied, but he didn't pull away when she began wrapping the injury with gentle efficiency born of frontier necessity. "I'm Giselle Morrison," she said as she worked close enough now to see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent reading weather signs and danger in the high desert, and the small scars that marked someone who had lived hard in unforgiving places and somehow managed to survive with both body and honor intact. "Much obliged for the doctoring, Miss Morrison." His voice carried formal courtesy, but she noticed how his breathing changed subtly when her fingers brushed his sun-darkened skin while securing the makeshift bandage. "Just Giselle will suffice. And you earned that money through skill and courage, probably the most honest $50 anyone's made in this town for quite some time. Might well be the last honest money I see for a considerable while," he said quietly, then seemed to regret revealing even that small glimpse of his circumstances. Before she could ask what he meant by such an ominous statement, her younger brother Percy appeared at her elbow, like a worried shadow given substance. At 16, he was all sharp angles and wounded pride with the gangling frame of a boy growing too fast, and the persistent cough that had plagued him since childhood pneumonia nearly claimed his life 3 winters past. Alkali grit coated his dark hair, and his breathing came harder than it should from the day's excitement and his body's ongoing struggle with damaged lungs. "Giselle, we need to head home before the day gets any later," Percy said, casting a suspicious look at Nayati that belonged on someone twice his age. Chores won't wait for bull riding exhibitions, and those cattle need water before the sun sets. She could see the worry in her brother's young face that went far deeper than concern about routine ranch work. The Morrison spread what remained of it after 3 years of drought and mounting debts that seemed to grow like desert brush in a flash flood, needed every hour of daylight they could squeeze from each passing day just to maintain the illusion of viability. I should return to my responsibilities, she said to Nayati, then hesitated as if reluctant to break this unexpected connection that had formed between them. Will you be at the Silver Dollar tonight? Most folks gather there for supper and conversation after a day like today. Possibly, he said, which wasn't quite yes but wasn't no either, and carried the weight of someone who had learned to be cautious about commitments in uncertain territory. As Giselle and Percy walked toward their weather-beaten wagon, she found herself glancing back at the solitary figure still standing by the stockyard fence. Nayati had rolled his shoulders to test the injured arm, and she could see him studying the now docile bull with that same intense focus he had shown before the ride, as if the animal held secrets he was determined to unlock through sheer force of observation. You don't know the first thing about him, Percy muttered, following her backward glance with obvious disapproval that made him sound far older than his 16 years. I know he's got more backbone than most men twice his size, she replied, settling onto the wagon's hard wooden seat that had been polished smooth by years of use. Backbone doesn't pay banknotes or keep Henderson's hands off our land. Percy's voice carried a weariness that cut straight to her heart. Sometimes I wonder if we're just delaying the inevitable, Giselle. Fighting a war we can't win. The raw honesty in her brother's words revealed the depth of his understanding about their precarious situation. And she realized that Percy had been carrying far more of their burden than she had allowed herself to acknowledge. At 16, he possessed the bitter wisdom of someone who had watched his family's dreams crumble day by day. We've survived this long by not giving up, she said gently. That has to count for something. Does it when Henderson owns half the territory and has the law in his pocket? Percy coughed violently, then continued with devastating clarity. I may be young, Giselle, but I'm not blind. I see how he looks at you. I know what he's really after when he talks about business arrangements. The words stung because they carried bitter truth that couldn't be argued away with wishful thinking. Prairie Rose, their family ranch 5 miles west of town, was 3 months behind on the mortgage payment, and their creditor wasn't known for patience or mercy toward those who couldn't meet their obligations. Mike Henderson had made it abundantly clear that he was willing to take the land off their hands for a fraction of its worth, along with certain other considerations that made Giselle's skin crawl, like she had walked through spider webs in a dark cellar. But as they drove home through the gathering dusk, she couldn't shake the memory of steady, obsidian eyes and capable hands that had helped when help was desperately needed. In a territory where most men looked out only for themselves and their immediate kin, that kind of instinctive cooperation represented something precious and increasingly rare. Behind them in the stockyard, Nayati watched the Morrison wagon disappear into the heat shimmer that rose from the desert floor, and then turned his attention back to the bull that had provided him with $50 and considerably more questions than answers. The massive animal had calmed completely now, but something about this particular beast troubled him in ways he couldn't yet articulate. There had been a wildness in its eyes that spoke of recent capture rather than long domestication, and the scars on its hide suggested battles fought in country far from any civilized stockyard. Battles with predators and rivals that most ranch-raised cattle never encountered. He touched the brass button in his shirt pocket, the only tangible clue he possessed to his cousin Tasunki. Her mother was Lakota. Her given name means horse in Lakota, his disappearance and death. The button had been torn from a hand-tooled saddle their grandfather had crafted, and there had been dried blood crusted in its intricate Apache designs when he'd found it by the Snake River crossing 2 weeks ago. Hidden inside the hollow button, carefully wrapped in oiled silk, he had discovered something that transformed his quest from simple vengeance into something far more complex and dangerous. Tasunke had been more than just a cattle driver working for wages. Someone had been gathering intelligence about a conspiracy that reached far beyond Silverknife, documenting a network of corruption that involved territorial officials, federal contractors, and systematic theft of land and resources throughout the Southwest. The tiny map and coded notes hidden in the button revealed water sources, ranch boundaries, weapons, caches, and meeting places for what appeared to be a criminal organization operating under the protection of corrupt officials at every level of government. But most disturbing of all was a list of names written in careful script, including several that Nayati recognized as prominent territorial officials and others that meant nothing to him, but might prove significant to someone familiar with local politics and business relationships. At the bottom of the list, written in different ink and apparently added later, was a name that made his blood run cold. G. Morrison H's connection potential leverage. The implications were staggering and heartbreaking. If this intelligence was accurate, the woman who had helped him tend his wound and shown him kindness might be connected to Henderson in ways that neither of them understood. That would make her either a potential ally with inside knowledge of the rancher's operations or a dangerous enemy whose family ties could be used against him in ways he couldn't anticipate. The question was whether Henderson knew that his secrets had been discovered and whether he would be willing to harm innocent people to protect the criminal empire he had built on stolen land, diverted water, and the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened his operations. That evening brought storm clouds that gathered like dark omens over the desert mountains, promising violence in the sky that would mirror the violence building among the people below. The Silver Dollar Saloon was typical of frontier drinking establishments, rough wooden tables that had seen better decades, a bar constructed from planks laid across whiskey barrels, and sawdust scattered on the floor to absorb spilled liquor and the occasional splash of blood from disputes that escalated beyond mere words. Nayati had secured a corner table where he could observe the room's occupants while keeping his back to the wall, nursing a beer, and listening to fragmented conversations that might provide insight into Henderson's operations and the disappearance of his cousin. But the information he gathered was frustratingly incomplete, consisting mostly of whispered complaints about water shortages, missing cattle, and men who had asked too many questions and subsequently vanished without explanation. He had been waiting for nearly an hour when she entered the saloon, and the moment their eyes met across the crowded room, he knew that everything was about to become infinitely more complicated and dangerous than he had ever imagined. Giselle Morrison entered the Silver Dollar with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged wherever she chose to be. But there was something different about her tonight, a tension in her posture and a wariness in her green eyes that suggested she had learned something that frightened her. She scanned the room until she found him, then approached his corner table with her brother, following reluctantly in her wake. "Mind if we sit?" she asked directly. "I believe we need to have a serious conversation about matters of mutual interest and considerable danger." As they settled at the scarred wooden table, Nayati found himself studying her face in the flickering lamplight and noting subtle details he had missed during their first encounter. There was something about the shape of her eyes and the set of her jaw that reminded him of someone, though he couldn't immediately place the resemblance. "This is my brother Percy," she said as the boy nodded stiffly, his suspicion of Apache strangers evident in every line of his thin frame. "Nayati," he replied simply. I know who you are, and I believe I know why you're really here, she said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard by unfriendly ears. Word travels fast in a town this size. You're looking for information about someone who disappeared during a cattle drive 2 months ago. His attention sharpened immediately, though he was careful to keep his expression neutral. What do you know about that time period? More than I wish I did, she replied with obvious reluctance. There was a major cattle drive 2 months back, organized by several ranchers working together to get their herds to market before the drought made such operations impossible. But there were serious problems on that drive, problems that resulted in several men disappearing and never returning to Silverknife. What kind of problems? The official story involves a stampede during a storm with several drivers killed or lost in the confusion. But people who understand cattle work have been asking questions about details that don't add up properly. Her voice carried exhaustion beneath the strength. Sometimes I feel like I'm drowning in other people's secrets, while my own world falls apart piece by piece. Percy had been listening to this exchange with growing unease, and now he spoke up with startling insight. Seems to me that when secrets start piling up like tumbleweeds in a canyon, it usually means someone's been hurting them there on purpose. Question is whether we're smart enough to climb out before the whole pile catches fire. Both adults turned to stare at the 16-year-old, surprised by the sophisticated observation that revealed depths they hadn't suspected. Percy met their gazes steadily, his young face showing the kind of hard-won wisdom that came from watching his family's world crumble while being powerless to stop it. Maybe our troubles and his troubles are connected in ways we're only beginning to understand, Giselle said, turning back to Nayati with an expression that mixed determination with barely controlled fear. I discovered something yesterday, something that changes everything about our situation and probably puts all of us in considerable danger. She reached into her reticule and withdrew a yellowed piece of paper that looked like it had been folded and unfolded many times over the years. But she hesitated before showing it to him, clearly struggling with the emotional implications of what she was about to reveal. Before I share this with you, I need to know something, she said quietly. This investigation you're conducting, was it just about Henderson's cattle operations, or was someone looking into something larger? Nayati studied her face, reading the intelligence and courage there, and made a decision that would bind their fates together in ways neither could yet fully comprehend. He reached into his shirt and withdrew Tasunke's brass button, carefully extracting the hidden documents that had been concealed inside. My cousin was investigating a conspiracy that reaches far beyond Silverknife, he said quietly, spreading the papers on the table between them. Corruption involving territorial officials, federal contractors, and systematic theft of public lands and resources throughout the Southwest. Giselle's eyes widened as she examined the documents, recognizing some of the names and understanding immediately that her family's troubles were part of a much larger pattern of criminal activity. This explains everything, she whispered, then produced her own document, a letter, written in faded ink that bore the letterhead of a St. Louis law firm. Henderson isn't just trying to steal our ranch. He's my uncle, my father's older brother, who drove him to flee Missouri under an assumed name 20 years ago. The revelation hit Nayati like a physical blow, confirming the intelligence hidden in the button, while also explaining Henderson's particular interest in acquiring the Morrison Ranch through legal manipulation rather than simple violence. The rancher wasn't just trying to expand his land holdings, he was trying to keep family secrets buried and maintain control over relatives who might pose a threat to his criminal empire if they learned the truth about their connections. Does Henderson know that you've discovered this relationship? He asked. I don't think so, but I can't be certain. He made strange comments during his recent visit about me reminding him of family members, but I didn't understand what he meant at the time. This information puts you in mortal danger, Nayati said bluntly. Henderson has been eliminating people to protect secrets that are probably far less damaging than a family relationship that could expose his true identity and criminal background to federal investigation. Before either of them could respond to this alarming assessment, the saloon's batwing doors swung open with dramatic flourish, and Deputy Sheriff Joseph Glass-Eyed Joe strutted into the room like an actor taking center stage. His badge glinted in the lamplight, his gun hand rested casually on the butt of his holstered Colt, and his artificial eye caught the light like a malevolent star as he surveyed the room's occupants with obvious hostile intent. The normal buzz of conversation died away to nervous whispers as heads turned to watch the deputy's entrance. Joe's remaining natural eye swept the room methodically until it fixed on their table with the kind of predatory focus that made small animals freeze in terror when confronted by hunting cats. He approached with the swagger of someone completely comfortable with using his authority to intimidate civilians, his boots clicking on the wooden floor like the ticking of a clock counting down to violence. "Well, well," Joe drawled in a voice that carried clearly across the suddenly quiet room. "If it ain't the Apache bull rider who's been causing such a stir around town, having private conversations with respectable young ladies about matters that probably don't concern him." Just sharing a drink and conversation with new friends, Deputy Nayati replied evenly, his own voice carrying no challenge, but also no deference to Joe's corrupt authority. "New friends, is it?" Joe's laugh held no humor whatsoever. Funny thing about new friendships, that they sometimes lead to old troubles catching up to folks who thought they could escape their past by moving to new territories and taking different names. The threat was as clear as a rattlesnake's warning, and it confirmed that Henderson knew about the Morrison family's true identity and their connection to his own criminal past. But Nayati's expression didn't change by so much as the flicker of an eyelash. "I'm not running from anything, Deputy. Just someone looking for honest work and straight answers to reasonable questions about missing relatives." Questions about missing Indians and cattle drives that happened months ago seems like ancient history to me, not the kind of thing that should concern someone who's supposedly just passing through our peaceful community. Before Nayati could respond, Joe had turned his attention to Giselle with uncomfortable intensity that now carried additional layers of menace, given what they had learned about her family connection to Henderson. "Miss Morrison, I'm surprised to find you socializing with strangers when your family's facing such serious difficulties. Thought you'd be too busy looking for solutions to your current problems to have time for entertaining drifters and troublemakers. I'm simply offering hospitality to someone who helped save lives yesterday," she replied with icy politeness that barely concealed her growing anger and revulsion. "I would think that kind of civic-minded behavior would earn approval rather than suspicion from our local law enforcement." "Oh, it does indeed, Miss Morrison. Community spirit is always admirable, especially when demonstrated by attractive young ladies who understand the importance of making wise choices about their associations and future plans. Your family's got a long history in this territory, deep roots that go back further than some folks might realize." The words carried multiple layers of meaning, all of them threatening, and Giselle's jaw tightened with barely controlled fury. But before she could respond to this thinly veiled acknowledgement of Henderson's knowledge about their family relationship, Joe had already moved on, making his way to the bar, where another of Henderson's men waited with a glass of whiskey and what appeared to be a sealed envelope that changed hands with practiced discretion. "Friendly fellow," Nayati observed dryly once Joe was out of earshot. "Joe's nothing more than Henderson's trained attack dog." Percy muttered with the kind of bitter wisdom that belonged on someone twice his age. "Does whatever Mike tells him to do, no questions, asked, no conscience involved in any of his decisions." which means Henderson knows about our conversation and will probably take steps to prevent further cooperation between us. Giselle said quietly, "We need to be very careful about how we proceed from this point forward." They spent the next hour working out the basic framework of an alliance that would benefit all of them, while minimizing the risks to innocent people who might get caught in the crossfire. Giselle possessed knowledge of Henderson's operations and had access to parts of Silverknife where an Apache stranger might attract dangerous attention. Nayati had the skills necessary to investigate hazardous situations, and if circumstances required it, to fight his way out of whatever trouble such investigations might uncover. But most importantly, they now understood that their individual problems were connected to a much larger pattern of corruption and violence that threatened everyone in the territory who believed in justice and the rule of law over the arbitrary power of men like Henderson. "There's something else you should know," Giselle said, as they prepared to part company and return to their respective homes. "Something I overheard here tonight that suggests Henderson is planning something catastrophic for the Harvest Festival next week." "What kind of catastrophic event?" Nayati asked. "I'm not certain of the details. But there's a woman in town who teaches at the schoolhouse who's been documenting Henderson's criminal activities for years. If we could make contact with her and combine our information, we might have enough evidence to convince federal authorities to intervene before Henderson implements whatever he's planning." "Now that's extremely dangerous," Nayati warned. "If Henderson discovers we're working together to expose his operations, then we'd better make sure he doesn't discover it until it's too late for him to stop us." She replied with a determination that reminded him powerfully of the courage she had shown when facing down the rampaging bull. The next morning brought a young man Nayati had noticed around town, but never spoken with directly. David Henderson worked at the assay office, a lean 18-year-old with intelligent eyes and the kind of quiet demeanor that suggested someone wrestling with internal conflicts. Unlike his employer's other associates, David carried himself without the swagger or barely concealed violence that characterized most of Henderson's men. "You're the Apache who rode the bull," David said as he approached Nayati outside the boarding house where he was staying. "I am," Nayati replied carefully, noting the tension in the young man's voice and posture. "I heard you're asking questions about someone who disappeared during a cattle drive 2 months ago. Someone named Tasunke." The name hit Nayati like a physical blow, confirming that this young man possessed information that could be crucial to his investigation. "What do you know about that?" David looked around nervously, then gestured toward a small cafe at the end of the street. "Buy me breakfast and I'll tell you what I saw that night. But you should know that talking to me about this puts both of us in considerable danger." Over eggs, bacon, and coffee that reminded Nayati of better times, David revealed information that added horrifying new dimensions to Henderson's criminal activities. "I was working late at the assay office updating records for the mining claims Henderson controls throughout the territory." David began quietly. "It was past midnight when I saw riders approaching from the direction of Snake River Crossing. They had someone with them, someone whose hands were tied and who was obviously a prisoner." "Could you see who it was?" "An Apache younger than you, wearing the kind of clothes that cattle drivers favor. The prisoner was struggling, trying to break free, and I could hear shouting even through the office windows." "What happened next?" David's face went pale as he continued. "Henderson met them in the alley behind his office building. I couldn't hear everything they were saying, but it was clear they were questioning the prisoner about something. When the Apache refused to cooperate, Henderson..." David paused, swallowing hard. "Henderson shot him, just like that. No trial, no mercy, just cold-blooded murder." The confirmation of Tasunki's death filled Nayati with rage that threatened to overwhelm his ability to think clearly. But he forced himself to focus on gathering the information he would need to bring Henderson to justice for this crime and all the others he had committed. "Why are you telling me this?" Nayati asked. "It's dangerous for you to be seen talking to me about Henderson's activities." "Because I'm tired of being part of something evil," David replied with tears in his young eyes. "Because that Apache they murdered was probably somebody's family just like you're somebody's family. And because Henderson—" David's voice broke, and it took him several moments to regain his composure. "Because Mike Henderson is my father, and I can't live with what he's become." The revelation added yet another layer of complexity to an already dangerous situation. David Henderson was the rancher's illegitimate son, someone with inside knowledge of his father's operations, but also someone whose betrayal would be met with deadly force if discovered. "How long have you known?" Nayati asked gently. "My whole life. My mother told me before she died that my father was a powerful man in Silverknife. But she made me promise never to approach him or try to claim any kind of relationship. She said it would be dangerous for both of us." "But you've been working for him." "I needed employment, and the assay office was the only position available when I arrived in town 6 months ago. I thought maybe if I proved myself capable and trustworthy, he might eventually acknowledge me. Instead, I've learned that he's a monster who destroys everything he touches." David's cooperation would be invaluable in gathering evidence against Henderson's criminal organization, but it would also put the young man in mortal danger if his father discovered the betrayal. The question was whether David possessed the courage necessary to follow through with such a risky course of action. "What kind of access do you have to his records?" Nayati asked. "Complete access. I maintain all the documentation for his mining claims, water rights, and property acquisitions. I also have keys to his office building and safe, since I'm responsible for updating legal documents and financial records." "Would you be willing to help us gather evidence that could expose his crimes and bring federal authorities into the situation?" David stared into his coffee cup for several long moments, weighing the implications of a decision that would determine the course of his entire future. When he finally looked up, his eyes held the kind of desperate determination that came from someone who had reached the limits of his ability to live with moral compromise. "Yes," he said simply, "but we'll need to move quickly. There are signs that Henderson is planning something catastrophic, something that will eliminate all his enemies while making their deaths appear to be tragic accidents." That evening, the conspirators met at the schoolhouse on Silverknife's southern edge, where Sylvia Chen had spent 3 years documenting Henderson's criminal activities with the methodical precision of someone who understood that incomplete evidence would be worse than useless against such a powerful and dangerous opponent. At 32, Sylvia possessed the kind of sharp analytical intelligence that would have made her a formidable attorney or investigative journalist in a more civilized location. Instead, she taught reading, writing, and arithmetic to the children of ranchers and townspeople, while secretly compiling what was probably the most comprehensive documentation of frontier corruption and violence that anyone had ever attempted. "Your cousin's investigation was remarkably thorough," Sylvia said quietly as she examined the documents hidden in Tasunki's brass button. "This intelligence about federal contracts and territorial corruption confirms everything I've been documenting, but it also reveals connections I hadn't suspected. Henderson's operation is much larger than any of us realized," Nayati replied. "What we're dealing with isn't just local crime, it's part of a systematic effort to steal land and resources throughout the entire Southwest, with protection from corrupt officials at every level of government." which explains why conventional law enforcement has been useless. Giselle added her voice, carrying the bitter wisdom of someone who had learned not to trust the authorities who were supposed to protect honest citizens. Henderson isn't just bribing Deputy Joe. He's got connections that reach all the way to Washington. Sylvia nodded grimly and produced an additional folder of documents she had compiled over the past week. The situation has become even more urgent since our last intelligence gathering. Henderson is planning something catastrophic for the Harvest Festival, something that will eliminate his primary enemies while appearing to be a tragic accident. She spread out maps showing planned cattle stampede routes through the main street during the festival's peak hours, along with lists of targets that included not just Henderson's obvious enemies, but also their family members and anyone who might seek revenge for their deaths. Most disturbing of all were detailed plans for using stockpiled dynamite to destroy the courthouse and other buildings that contained evidence of Henderson's crimes. "How did you obtain this information?" Nayati asked. "My husband Frank's business gives us access to buildings throughout Silverknife, including Henderson's private offices. But more importantly, we've been developing a network of informants among Henderson's own employees' men who've grown disgusted with his increasingly violent methods and are willing to provide intelligence about his plans." As they worked through the evidence, Sylvia shared information that created an even stronger bond between the conspirators. Hidden among her personal papers was correspondence with a federal marshal in Prescott, who had been building a case against the territorial corruption network, but needed more evidence before he could act. "Marshal William Brady has 20 years' experience fighting corruption on the frontier," she explained. "His reputation for honesty and courage is well established, and he's already survived several attempts on his life by men who didn't want their crimes exposed." "When can we meet with him?" Giselle asked. "He's planning to arrive in Silverknife within the next few days, traveling undercover and avoiding the main roads where Henderson's men maintain surveillance. If we can provide him with the evidence we've gathered plus proof of the festival massacre plan, he should have enough to justify federal intervention." David had remained quiet during most of this conversation, but now he spoke up with information that changed everything about their tactical situation. "There's something else you need to know," he said quietly. "Henderson has increased security around his office building and private residence. He's brought in additional gunmen from outside the territory, and he's installed alarm systems that will alert his men to any unauthorized entry." "How do you know this?" Sylvia asked. "Because I helped install the systems," David replied with obvious reluctance. "He told me it was to protect against Apache raids and Mexican bandits. But I now understand he was preparing for exactly the kind of investigation we're conducting." The revelation meant that their planned infiltration of Henderson's office would be far more dangerous than originally anticipated. But it also meant that Henderson was expecting trouble, which suggested their activities had already attracted his attention in ways that put all of them at risk. "There's one advantage we still possess," David continued. "Henderson doesn't know that I've discovered his true relationship to me, and he certainly doesn't suspect that I would ever cooperate with his enemies. I still have legitimate access to his building and records, which means I might be able to disable the security systems from the inside." "Now that's incredibly dangerous," Nayati warned. "If your father discovers your betrayal." "He'll kill me," David finished matter-of-factly. "But he's going to kill a lot of innocent people if we don't stop him, and I can't live with that kind of blood on my hands." As the meeting concluded and they prepared to return to their respective homes, Giselle found herself walking beside Nayati through the star-filled darkness. The danger they were facing had created an intimacy between them that went far beyond their initial alliance of convenience, and she was acutely aware of his presence in the moonlight. They paused at a fork in the trail where they would separate and take different routes home, both reluctant to break the connection that had formed between them during their shared struggle against Henderson's corruption. "Are you frightened?" she asked quietly. "Terrified," he replied honestly. "But not of Henderson or his men. I'm frightened of what might happen to people I care about if we fail to stop what he's planning." The admission hung between them, and Giselle felt her pulse quicken despite the danger surrounding them. "People you care about." He was quiet for several long moments, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability she hadn't heard before. Tasunke used to say that the desert teaches you to recognize what's precious before it's too late to protect it. She laughed like water running over stones after summer rain, the kind of sound that makes you remember there's still beauty in the world, even when everything seems poisoned by greed and violence. The unexpected sharing of such a personal memory took Giselle's breath away. She could hear the grief and love in his voice, and she understood that he was trusting her with something sacred. "She sounds like someone I would have liked to know," Giselle said softly. "She would have loved your courage," Nayati replied, his eyes reflecting starlight as he looked at her. "That's what frightens me most, the thought of losing someone else who has that same fire, that same determination to protect what matters." His words opened something deep within her, a wellspring of fear and longing that she had kept carefully hidden beneath layers of responsibility and strength. "Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, terrified that I'm going to fail, Percy, that all my efforts to save our ranch are just delaying the inevitable. I'm so tired of being strong, Nayati. So tired of pretending I know what I'm doing when everything feels like it's falling apart." The raw honesty in her voice revealed the vulnerability she had been carrying alone for so long, and Nayati felt something shift between them, a recognition that went deeper than attraction or shared danger. "You're not alone anymore," he said simply, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "Whatever happens in the days ahead, you don't have to carry that burden by yourself." Before either could say more, the distant sound of hoofbeats reminded them of the dangers that surrounded them. They separated quickly, taking different paths home, but the connection forged in that moment of shared vulnerability would carry them through the trials ahead. 3 days later, Marshal Brady arrived in Silver Knife under cover of darkness, traveling with a small group of federal deputies who had positioned themselves in the hills surrounding the town. But instead of the immediate intervention they had hoped for, Brady brought disturbing news about the scope of Henderson's criminal organization. The corruption reaches further than any of us imagined. Brady told them during a clandestine meeting at an abandoned mine shaft outside town. Henderson's organization has tentacles throughout the territorial government, and they've been systematically eliminating anyone who poses a threat to their operations. "What kind of evidence do you need to justify federal action?" Giselle asked. "Documentary proof of the festival massacre plan, plus testimony from witnesses who can verify Henderson's involvement in specific crimes. But most importantly, we need to catch him in the act of committing federal crimes that can't be explained away by corrupt local officials." "We can provide all of that," Nayati said. "But we'll need your help to ensure that Henderson doesn't escape justice through violence or political connections." Brady studied the evidence they had gathered, his weathered face growing grimmer with each document he examined. "This is more than enough to justify federal intervention," he said finally. "But we'll need to coordinate our efforts carefully. Henderson is expecting trouble, and he's prepared to fight rather than surrender peacefully." That night, as storm clouds gathered over the desert mountains, Nayati made his final preparations for what would prove to be the most dangerous mission of his life. The plan called for him to infiltrate Henderson's office building with David's help, gathering the final evidence needed, while federal marshals positioned themselves to prevent Henderson's escape. But as he checked his weapons and equipment, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with their intelligence. Henderson was too smart and too experienced to leave himself vulnerable to the kind of straightforward infiltration they were planning, and the ease with which they had gathered information about his security measures suggested that he might be aware of their activities and preparing a trap. The rear door of Henderson's building opened silently under David's key, and Nayati slipped inside like smoke, returning to haunt the scene of ancient crimes. But immediately, he sensed that something was different, and the building felt charged with anticipation, as if the very air itself was waiting for violence to erupt. David led him through darkened corridors toward Henderson's private office, where the safe contained documents that would provide conclusive proof of the festival massacre plan. But as they climbed the stairs to the second floor, Nayati heard sounds that made his blood run cold, voices discussing preparations for visitors, talking about traps that had been prepared and tactics that would be employed when their expected guests arrived. "It's a trap," he whispered to David. But before the young man could respond, lights blazed throughout the building and armed men appeared at both ends of the corridor. "Now welcome to the party, Apache." Henderson's voice boomed from his office. "I've been expecting you." Instead of the empty building they had anticipated, they found themselves surrounded by Henderson's gunmen, with no apparent route of escape. But as despair threatened to overwhelm him, Nayati noticed something that gave him hope. David wasn't acting surprised by the ambush, and his positioning suggested he had been expecting exactly this situation. "I'm sorry," David said quietly, but his eyes were signaling toward a window that led to the building's roof. "But sometimes you have to make sacrifices to accomplish larger objectives." Before Nayati could ask what he meant, the young man had produced a stick of dynamite from his coat and was lighting the fuse with a match that flared like a falling star in the darkened corridor. "Get to the roof," David shouted, throwing himself at the nearest gunman, while the burning fuse counted down the seconds to explosion. "Tell my father I chose to be better than he raised me to be." The dynamite exploded with devastating force, bringing down part of the second floor and creating the diversion that Nayati needed to reach the window and escape onto the roof. Behind him, he could hear gunfire and shouting as Henderson's men tried to restore order while dealing with the fire that was spreading through the wooden structure. But David Henderson's sacrifice had accomplished more than just creating a diversion. It had also triggered a coordinated assault by Marshal Brady and his federal deputies, who used the confusion to surround the building and prevent Henderson's escape. The rooftop was treacherous in the darkness, made more dangerous by the storm that was finally breaking over Silver Knife. Lightning split the sky as Nayati made his way across the interconnected buildings, seeking a way down to the street level, where he could rejoin the federal marshals. But as he reached the edge of the final building, he found his path blocked by Mike Henderson himself, the rancher, having used his own escape route to reach the rooftop ahead of his pursuer. "End of the line, Apache." Henderson snarled, his revolver gleaming in the lightning flashes. "You've cost me everything, my business, my reputation, and now my son. But at least I'll have the satisfaction of killing you personally. Your son died because he chose honor over corruption." Nayati replied, his own weapon drawn and ready. "Something you never understood and probably never could. Honor." Henderson's laugh was harsh with bitter rage. "Honor doesn't build empires or accumulate wealth. Honor doesn't survive in country this hard, where only the strong prosper and the weak get buried in unmarked graves." The two men faced each other across the rain-slicked roof, both aware that only one of them would survive the next few minutes. Around them, the storm raged with increasing fury, turning the wooden surfaces treacherous and making accurate shooting nearly impossible. "You killed my cousin for asking questions," Nayati said. "For trying to expose the truth about your criminal activities. I killed your cousin because she was interfering with business operations worth millions of dollars. Just like I'm going to kill you for destroying 20 years of careful planning and profitable investment." The admission that Tasunke had been a woman struck Nayati like a physical blow, confirming suspicions he had harbored but never been able to prove. His cousin had been working undercover as a male cattle driver, using her disguise to infiltrate Henderson's organization and gather the intelligence that had ultimately led to this confrontation. "She died trying to bring justice to this territory," Nayati said. "And she succeeded, even though she didn't live to see the results." Justice," Henderson spat. "There's no such thing as justice on the frontier Indian. There's only power and the will to use it against anyone who stands in your way." Lightning illuminated the rooftop like daylight, revealing Henderson's finger tightening on his trigger. But in that same instant, Nayati dove to his left, rolling across the wet wooden surface as Henderson's shot split the air where his head had been a heartbeat before. The Apache came up firing his bullet, taking Henderson in the shoulder and spinning the rancher around. But the big man kept his footing and his grip on his weapon, raising it for another shot despite the blood streaming down his arm. A second exchange of gunfire echoed across the storm-lashed rooftop, with both men seeking whatever cover they could find among the chimneys and ventilation structures. Henderson's experience and ruthlessness made him a formidable opponent. But Nayati's superior agility and desert-trained reflexes gave him advantages that gradually began to tell in the deadly confrontation. The end came when Henderson, blinded by rain, and blood stepped too close to the building's edge while trying to flank his opponent. His boot slipped on the wet wood, and he fell backward into the alley below with a scream that was cut short by the sickening impact of his body against the hardpan earth. By the time Nayati reached the ground level, Marshal Brady and his deputies had secured the scene and were already beginning the process of arresting Henderson's surviving associates. The rancher himself lay motionless in the alley, his neck broken by the fall, his pale eyes staring sightlessly at the storm clouds that continued to rage overhead. "It's over," Brady said as he approached Nayati, who was kneeling beside David Henderson's body in the ruins of the burned office building. "Henderson's dead, his organization is destroyed, and we have enough evidence to prosecute corrupt officials throughout the territorial government." "What about him?" Nayati asked, looking down at the young man who had sacrificed his life to ensure that justice would triumph over corruption. "He'll be remembered as a hero," Brady replied. "Someone who chose to do the right thing despite the personal cost, someone who proved that redemption is possible, even for those born into evil circumstances." As the storm finally began to clear and the first light of dawn touched the eastern mountains, Nayati found himself standing with Giselle and Percy among the ruins of Henderson's criminal empire. The immediate danger was over, the festival massacre had been prevented, and Silverknife was finally free from the shadow of corruption and violence that had poisoned the community for so many years. "What happens now?" Giselle asked quietly, her hand finding his in the growing light. "Now we start building something better on the ruins of what Henderson tried to create," he replied, drawing her closer to his side. "The desert teaches patience to those who would survive, but it also teaches us to recognize when the rains finally come." 6 months later, Silverknife bore little resemblance to the fear-paralyzed community that had existed under Henderson's reign of terror. The Harvest Festival had proceeded as originally planned, but instead of being the site of a carefully orchestrated massacre, it had become a celebration of justice and renewal that attracted visitors from throughout the territory. Nayati Morrison, for He had taken Giselle's family name when they married in a ceremony that brought together Apache traditions and frontier customs, stood with his wife on the porch of their expanded ranch house, watching the sun set over land that had been watered with blood and tears but was now green with genuine prosperity. The child growing within Giselle represented not just their love for each other, but their faith in a future where Henderson's evil no longer threatened innocent people. They had chosen to name the baby Tasunke, if it was a girl, honoring the memory of a cousin whose courage and sacrifice had made their happiness possible. Any regrets about turning down Marshal Brady's offer to serve as a special deputy U.S. Marshal? Giselle asked as they sat together on the porch swing that Percy had built as a wedding present. None whatsoever. Nayati replied, his arm tightening around her shoulders as they watched the lights of Silverknife twinkling in the distance. I spent too many years moving from place to place, never putting down roots or forming the kind of connections that make life meaningful. Now that I've found what I was looking for, I'm not about to give it up for professional ambition. The Apache who had come to Silverknife seeking justice for his murdered cousin had found something far more valuable than revenge. He had discovered the meaning of home, the power of love, and the satisfaction that came from building something lasting and good in a world that too often rewarded violence and selfishness over cooperation and mutual respect. And soon there would be a child to carry forward the legacy of courage and justice that Tasunke had died to establish, ensuring that her sacrifice would continue to bear fruit in future generations, who would never know her name, but would benefit from the freedom she had purchased with her life.